Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday night Bible study at Providence United Methodist Church. My name is Jack Allen. I'm the pastor at Providence. I'm glad you're tuning in and joining us this evening. We're going to continue our work looking at the prophets. In particular, we're going to be continuing to use Walter Brueggemann's book. You recall Reality, Grief, and Hope. Brueggemann sets together the idea of the prophet and the idea of the world, and he gives three words, if you will, to put these things together to contradict one another. For the prophet, again, it is the idea of reality, grief, and hope. But those words that they're contradicting that the world gives us are ideology, denial, and despair. And so we've gone through the first two previous weeks, and so this week we're picking up that third word, that word of hope that the prophet has to offer us, but that word of hope comes in the face of despair when the world tells us that all is lost, that there is no hope, that the only thing we should do is despair. The prophet steps in and offers us that word of hope. I think it's important to point out, it's probably understood though, that these build on each other. Right? If you're going to get to a place of hope, you can't get there through ideology, denial, and then all of a sudden have hope. Right? Hope comes from a place of true realism, to be able to establish, to be able to identify what is going on in our lives and in the world and what might be before us, to truly grieve it, to truly grieve the loss we might have, to express those feelings we have. And then that will take us to a place of hope. If we remain in ideology and then turn to denial, the place we'll get to eventually is despair. We won't get to hope. And so again, these build on each other, and we've been talking about these for the last couple of weeks. And so this week we have our last one, looking at hope versus despair and how we get there. As a way to kick us off, I want to show a video clip to begin with. This is from one of my favorite movies. I guess I shared with you last week that one of my Lenten disciplines has been watching God on Trial during Holy Week. Well, if that's the case, I think this is also true, that after Holy Week, after Easter that is, I tend to watch The Shawshank Redemption. I love that movie. It might be one of my favorite movies of all time. The Shawshank Redemption is the tale of a man by the name of Andy Dufresne, who is tried and convicted for murder of his wife. Whether or not he did it or not is a question the whole movie wrestles with. But while he's there, it's a story of him being in jail, in prison, in exile, if you will. And while he's there, he encounters a man by the name of Red. And Red is what he would call himself an institutionalized man. He's somebody who's come to accept that this is where he lives, that this is the facts of the world. In some ways, though, you might say Red's in denial. And there's this powerful scene right in the middle where Red and Andy, they have this conversation around the idea of hope and what hope can do for a person. To set the scene for us, Andy has just broken in, if you will, to the microphone that goes all across the campus of the prison, and he puts on music. He plays music for the whole campus to hear. And of course, the warden and the guards, they don't like that too much, and so Andy's sent to the hole. He's sent to solitary confinement for a couple of weeks, and then this is the scene we're about to watch is right when he gets out of solitary confinement. Right when he gets out of being in the hole, isolated from everyone else, he comes and he sits down with his friends, and Morgan Freeman plays the part of Red, and you'll hear them in just a moment as they kind of spar back and forth with this idea of hope. So let's take a listen.
Hey, look who's here.
Maestro.
Hey. And you couldn't play something good, huh? Hank Williams or something?
They broke the door down before I could take requests.
Was it worth it? 2 weeks in the hall?
Easiest time I ever did.
There's no such thing as easy time in the hole.
That's right, a week in the hole is like a year.
Damn straight.
I had Mr. Mozart to keep me company.
So they let you tote that record player down there, huh?
It's in here. In here. That's the beauty of music. They can't get that from you. Haven't you ever felt that way about music?
Well, I played a mean harmonica as a younger man. Lost interest in it, though. Didn't make much sense in here.
Here's where it makes the most sense. You need it so you don't forget.
Forget.
Forget that There are places in the world that aren't made out of stone, that there's something inside that they can't get to, that they can't touch. It's yours.
What are you talking about?
Hope.
Hope. Let me tell you something, my friend. Hope is a dangerous thing. Hope can drive a man insane. It's got no use on the inside. You better get used to that idea.
Like Brooks did.
You know, I can't help but think about hope and think about our Ash Wednesday service. For those of you that were with us on Wednesday night, you may recall that was the service where I tried to get us to sing Taizé worship. It was pretty brutal on my part to throw that on us without any practice or anything else. Lesson learned, I suppose. But beyond the poor attempt at Taizé worship, we talked about in the sermon the Stockdale Paradox. The Stockdale Paradox coming from Admiral Stockdale, who was a prisoner of war. He stayed at the infamous Hanoi Hilton there with several other Americans. Jim Collins, afterwards, when he was returned and several years later when he was back home in America, asked him why he was able to last, why he and so many other Americans were able to survive that imprisonment while others weren't able to. And Stockdale attributed it to this paradox of hope. He said that there were those that had false hope, those that would tell themselves over and over and over again, well, we're going to be out by Christmas. We're going to be out by President's Day. We're going to be out by Ash Wednesday. We're going to be out by Easter. We're going to be out by Memorial. And they kept telling themselves over and over and over again, this is when it's going to end. And because they kept being let down time and time again, he said they didn't make it. In fact, he said they died from a broken heart. He said, and then there are those on the opposite end of the spectrum, those that said over and over again, there is no hope. All is lost. All is lost. Don't hope. Don't think we're getting out of here. We're going to die here. There's no doubt in my mind. And he said eventually them as well, they did not make it. He said the ones that made it, though, were the ones that had hope, but it was an ultimate hope. It was a different kind of hope, a hope that wasn't based in falsehoods, a hope that didn't say, well, surely a week from now we're getting out. It was a hope that said, I believe I'm getting out of here. I don't necessarily think it's tomorrow, but I do have hope that I will get out of here. That kind of hope that's grounded in realism, that kind of hope that's grounded in grief for the current situation, is what's attributed to Admiral Stockdale as the Stockdale Paradox, which ironically enough, I believe, is what we find in the prophets, what Walter Brueggemann points us to with the role of the prophet. When the people are grieving, or even when the people have a sense of denial, to bring them to hope is to bring them to a place where they can grieve and have true hope, where they don't fall into that pit of despair. One of the prophets that points us to this is the prophet Isaiah. We've been citing several different prophets. Let's spend just a few moments talking about Isaiah. Isaiah is a large prophet, a large book in the Bible, that is, in the Old Testament. 66 chapters, I believe, off the top of my head. Don't quote me on that. But Isaiah has this large work, this large canon of work. But scholars believe that you can actually break Isaiah into 2, maybe even 3 parts. In fact, Isaiah chapter 1 through 39 is believed to be first Isaiah. This is the part where Israel isn't in exile yet. Isaiah the prophet is speaking and saying, repent, turn, doom and gloom is coming, trying to speak that word of realism to a community living in ideology. But then when you get Deutero-Isaiah, or 2nd Isaiah, beginning in chapter 40. Again, some attribute it all the way to chapter 54, and then 3rd Isaiah kicks in. Some say actually 2nd Isaiah is just chapters 40 through 66, whatever it may be. Chapter 40 begins this new Isaiah. The language changes, the time frame changes. And Isaiah begins to speak this word of comfort, or this word of hope, to the people. These are familiar and famous passages. We usually read them actually during Advent. Advent is when we read a lot of Isaiah 40, this time where Isaiah is speaking a word of comfort, a word of hope to prepare because God's about to do something. Hope is coming to a people who are in exile, who are falling into this pit of despair. Isaiah says, no, friends, we have hope. I want to read beginning in chapter 40, verse 1. Let's pull that up right now. And so Isaiah 41 says, "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak compassionately to Jerusalem, and proclaim to her that her compulsory service has ended, that her penalty has been paid, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice is crying out, 'Clear the Lord's way in the desert. Make a level highway in the wilderness for our God. Every valley will be raised up, and every mountain and hill will be flattened. Uneven ground will become level, and rough terrain a valley plain. The Lord's glory will appear, and all humanity will see it together. The Lord's mouth has commanded it." Again, this is Isaiah 40, the very beginning of this Isaiah who's speaking to Israelites who have been in exile. And this is the first voice we hear from the prophets. So the prophets have been saying, your ideology, your denial, it's not going to save you. Bad things are coming. They're taken off to exile. Nothing's being said. The people have been lamenting, have been falling into this pit of despair. The Lord has abandoned us. Again, we read that from Lamentations last week, right? Unless you're angry with us. This is the word crying out for the people, but they don't hear anything from God. And then in steps Isaiah, this prophet who offers a word of hope. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. This is the first word we hear from the prophet, is to comfort the people. If we jump ahead to the end of Isaiah chapter 40, we read this. This is how this chapter ends. "Why do you say, Jacob, and declare, Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my God ignores my predicament? Don't you know, haven't you heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He doesn't grow tired or weary. His understanding is beyond human reach, giving power to the tired and reviving the exhausted. Youths will become tired and weary. Young men will certainly stumble. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will fly up on wings like eagles. They will run and not be tired. They will walk and not be weary." This word of hope from Isaiah is exactly what the people need to hear. It's exactly what they need to hear in that moment, right? That surely God's goodness and mercy will go on forever. Place your trust and hope in the Lord, for this is the word that God has for you today. Comfort, oh comfort my people. This is what the Lord says. If we keep going a little bit along, we're going to jump to chapter 54 and read beginning in verse 7. And notice the shift here, because again, this is the prophet who speaks all these things at once. Realism, grief, and also hope. Notice this shift beginning in verse 7 here, in chapter 54. We have this realism. "For a brief moment I abandoned you. In an outburst of rage I hid my face from you for a moment. These are like the days of Noah for me, when I promised that Noah's waters would never again cover the earth. Likewise I promise not to rage against you or rebuke you." There's a realism to it, right? God acknowledges, Isaiah acknowledges, this word of comfort and hope coming to the people acknowledges. Yeah, this wasn't great. I abandoned you. In an outburst of rage, I hid my face from you, but only for a moment. Now I'm consoling you. Now, says the Redeemer, the Lord. And again, verse 10, this is the ultimate truth, the ultimate hope we have here. "Though the mountains may shift and the hills may be shaken, my faithful love won't shift from you. My covenant of peace won't be shaken, says the Lord, the one who pities you, or as the NRSV says, the one who has compassion on you. So this is where Brueggemann points us towards in the role of the prophet, right, that we have there in Isaiah 54, especially with the idea of the prophet offering a word of hope to those who are grieving, those who are in exile. And that hope, though, based in some sort of realism, right? The reality of what actually happened, the grief of what happened, but then also our hope that we have in the Lord, our hope we have in God. And it would be easy to leave us here, I think, and especially from my point of view, just to say, go in peace. That's what you're supposed to do. Have a word of hope based in realism and based in grief too, acknowledging any pain or grief that we might have. But I must confess, this leaves me in a very confusing place. And so rather than just taking the easy way out and saying, yeah, that's what you should do, have fun, I'm going to try to articulate why this leaves me in a place of a little bit of a loss for words. It's going to be difficult to explain, but let's see if we can follow along here, my random thoughts. It leaves me in a difficult place because what I hear the prophet saying, especially in Isaiah 40, is what I heard the religious faithful saying all the way back in Jerusalem when the prophets had a word of realism against a word of ideology. Let's go back for just a second and unpack that. So remember, we said that what was going on in the kingdom, in the United Monarchy, was that the Israelites were living into this idea of the covenant of chosenness, right? The covenant that we get with Abraham, where God claims Abraham and says, I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people and all's going to be well. And that's what the Israelites keep espousing over and over and over again. Look, God's on our side. We don't have to worry about anything else. This God has chosen us. God just loves us more than everyone else, so all is well. We don't have to worry about anything. And the prophets call to account this idea of ideology versus realism. Yet you're living into an ideology. That's not real theology, if you will. That's not living into Torah, the covenant that we get with Moses, where God says, these are the parameters for which my people are going to live. And there's this tension back and forth that eventually leads us to grief versus denial, right? Being able to grieve that, nope, we aren't in the kingdom anymore, versus denial that says, no, God's chosen us. We don't have to worry about this. God's going to come through. God's going to save us because we have this ideology of we've just been chosen. God can do all things. Everything is well. But then we get to this word of hope. Again, I hear a lot of echoes of what we heard from the Israelite people, that the prophets said that's not good theology. This idea that, especially in Isaiah 40, this idea that, well, speak comfort to my people. God's heard your cry, and have you not heard? Have you not known? The Lord can do wonderful things. The Lord can lift you up on eagle's wings, right? And so just take heart. All will be well. God's going to act in mighty ways. And I think for me, again, it's in some ways, it's wrestling with this question of authenticity. Right, because for me personally, where I'm living today, not just in the midst of coronavirus, but just even living my life, I wrestle with this question all the time. Right, what is the faithful question to ask? What is the faithful response to God? It's interesting, I just finished up CPE, which stands for Clinical Pastoral Education. It's this class where you go through and you basically just kind of throw your guts on the table, or maybe your heart is maybe a better way to say it. You throw your heart on the table and you say, all right, this is what I believe, this is what I think, this is what I know, and it just gets picked apart. It gets dissected. People get to ask you questions. They get to question your questions and all these other things. And at the very end, there's a report that gets written, and that report gets submitted to the Board of Ordained Ministry. It gets submitted to a whole bunch of different groups. I get to read it as well, and my professor, my teacher, the one who was leading us, wrote this in my evaluation. He said that Jack wrestles with this God of judgment and God of grace. And we did spend a lot of time talking about it. But for me personally, it is this kind of idea of, okay, well, God of grace, I kind of hear in the ideology of all is well, it's all in God's hands, everything will be fine. God of judgment, I hear more of the, no, we're not living up to the standards here, people. We have to live a certain way. God's called us to live a certain way, and so we must live this way, and I tend to, get grace out of here. We're called to live by a God of judgment, if you will. And so I constantly wrestle with this. When is it appropriate to speak this word of judgment? When is it appropriate to speak this word of grace? I think for us today, for the prophets, right? When is it to speak this word of judgment? When is it to speak this word of grace? At what times do we need to hear this? Again, I think all of this is wrestling with this idea of authenticity of faith. And so to keep this conversation going, I want to move beyond Brueggemann for just a second. I want to pull in another voice. This is Dr. Richard Beck. Dr. Richard Beck is the professor and department chair of psychology at Abilene Christian University. Dr. Beck's areas of interest, I'm going to read this quote for us, is on the interface of Christian theology and psychology, with a particular focus on how existential issues affect Christian belief and practice. I'm going to say that one more time. This is what he's interested in. The interface of Christian theology and psychology, with a particular focus of how existential issues affect Christian belief and practice. In other words, how these things that pop up in life, how these things that affect us in life, these things that are thrown at us, these existential issues, how they then begin to affect our ideas of belief and practice, what they do to us, how they might change us. He wrote a book actually entitled what we're talking about here, Authenticity of Faith. I want to let you hear from him. This is just a very brief clip. Let's take a listen.
I think the big nugget at the center of authenticity of faith is this claim that Freud made almost 100 years ago, that religious belief is motivated by a need for consolation. It's a form of wishful thinking, that religious believers are too afraid to look at reality honestly. And what's interesting about that is that for almost 100 years, nobody's actually taken Freud up on that claim. Nobody's actually kind of put that idea to the test. And so authenticity of faith summarizes a couple years worth of research and different projects to essentially say, was Freud right? And the nugget at the end is that he wasn't. Freud was wrong. It's not to say that he didn't have a part of the truth, but that religious belief, what motivates it, cannot be reduced to wishful thinking, needs for consolation, and that religious believers are a pretty diverse lot. And there are lots of reasons why we come to faith and believe in God.
So as you can hear from Beck, that was kind of the purpose of his book there, to do this research on what does it mean to be authentic Christian? What does it mean to have authentic faith? This claim that that Freud put forward for us, that Christians basically can't deal with reality. They're just looking for something to make them feel better. And he says that actually that's not true. In fact, Christians are all over the place. Christians approach their faith and have authentic faith from a variety of different places and positions. He talks about this. In fact, he puts it on a matrix, on a diagram, if you will, to help better understand. And I'm a visual person, so I love to be able to see these things. I'm going to pull it up for us on our screen now. And as we can see, along the x-axis, he has categorized this idea of low complaint and high complaint. This is how he describes what it might be for Christians who have a lot of questions or don't have very many questions. This is what he says as complaints. Those who might say, you know what, just let go and let God. I don't have any questions. I don't question God. I just know that God's going to act in mighty ways. I don't complain a lot. I don't question a lot. I just have ultimate hope and faith in God. And so you might find yourself more on this x-axis on the low end of the scale, or the high end of the scale is those that question everything. That, I'm not just going to let go and let God. In fact, I'm going to ask a lot of questions of God. I'm going to complain a lot. I've got a lot of grief. I got a lot of sorrow. I got a lot of bones to pick with God, if you will. And he says the common misconception is that our job as Christians is to move to the lower end of the scale. That is, that if we move more towards the low complaint, if we find ourselves in a place where we're saying, I don't have any questions, I don't have any thoughts, I don't have any complaints, I just believe in God, the end, that somehow that makes us more of a faithful Christian. That somehow that makes us more of a faithful follower of Christ, that's the desire for all people. That's where we should be moving towards, that we all in some ways should be moving our way to find ourselves on the lower complaint end of the x-axis. But he says that, really and truly, we need to throw a y-axis in here, if you will. We need to offer something else. And so he has on the y-axis this idea of high communion and low communion. And what this suggests is how we commune with one another. And so high communion means we find ourselves engaging with others a lot. That we find ourselves putting ourselves in situations where we're around other believers, where we're having conversations and with other Christians a lot. And so that might be attendance in church. It might be going to Sunday school. But even more than that, this is having the questions of our faith, putting our faith before us and living that out in everyday lives with everyone we encounter. That's high communion. Low communion would be obviously the exact opposite of that, right? That we are disassociating ourselves, not even so much with church per se, but just not even engaging in any thoughts or questions, not even asking others, not even putting ourselves in positions where our faith can be questioned or challenged, or having the conversations that might spur us along, as the Bible verse would suggest there, iron sharpens iron. So if we aren't even putting our faith before us or trying to live in such ways that we dive deeper in our faith, this would be low communion. And so now with this grid, what we have here are these different boxes, if you will, that he categorizes different Christians. And so if you are those that have low complaints, if you're not questioning a lot of things, if you're just, let go and let God, but at the same time, you're also not engaging with the community. You're saying to yourself, well, let go and let God, so whatever, don't need to go to church, don't need to put my faith into action, don't need to do any of these things because God's going to send God's hands, who cares? Hakuna Matata, it means no worries, all those things. He would call that a disengaged believer, right? And you can kind of see and understand why that would be. And on the flip side, if you're somebody that, you have all the thoughts, questions, comments, you're constantly picking at God or asking God these questions or having a bone to pick or pointing holes in the religious faith. But at the same time, you're not engaging with anyone else. You're not going to church. You're not trying to be around others. You're not trying to hear what others might have to offer. At best, all you are is a spiritual critic. All you're doing is just pointing out things just for the sake of pointing out things. You're not really growing your faith. And so what we need to move towards isn't so much the questioning or the non-questioning. What we need to move towards is the being around one another. And not necessarily so much physically, especially at a time like this where it's hard to be around one another, but to be engaged in the conversations with one another, to be reading and studying other books or reading and studying our Bible, to be engaged in the spiritual disciplines that we have, to be in prayer, to be fasting, to be giving alms, to be studying the Word. All these things give way towards a high communion. And so whether or not we have low complaints or high complaints, whether or not we have few questions or a lot of questions, we need to be working our way towards high communion. And so the last two he has for us then is what he calls a summer Christian. Right? This is somebody who says, I don't really have a lot of questions. I don't really question my faith a lot. I'm pretty good. I have faith in God. I'm not in denial. I just believe in God, and I believe God has this, and everything will work out its way in the end because I have faith in God. This is what he calls more of a summer Christian. And on the flip side, makes sense, he calls this more of a winter Christian. Right? This is someone who is constantly questioning, constantly asking, my God, why have you forsaken me? How can you allow this to happen? Why do these things happen? All these other questions come to be. But by doing so, it doesn't make them less faithful as long as they're still engaging with the community, as long as they're still engaging with others. And so this is what he has before us as this idea of authentic faith, where we find ourselves. I think for us this evening especially, these are the questions we need to be asking ourselves. Specifically, where would you plant yourself on this grid? Where do you find yourself? Do you find yourself asking a lot of questions, probing your faith deeply or not? That's okay. That's okay. Again, anywhere on the x-axis you find yourself, brilliant, perfect. Just be honest with yourself, though. Be honest with where you find yourself. The real question, though, that we need to dig into is where do we find ourselves on the y-axis? How much are we engaging with others? And again, others doesn't have to be located in a Sunday school classroom. Others can be with how much are we engaging with those that have come before us in the faith, those that offer us books and Bible studies, those biblical writers themselves, reading the Psalms. How much are we engaging with others in the Christian faith, those that have gone before, those that are even with us now? And if we find ourselves where we plant ourselves on this grid, I think it's helpful because it allows ourselves to live into more truly who we are, while at the same time gives us places to grow. And so if we find ourselves more along the lines of maybe we're not summer Christians, maybe we're like spring Christians, right? We're a little closer to the middle of the y-axis, but we're still on the summer side. That's okay. Or maybe you're more like I would find myself, probably somewhere firmly planted in the autumn or the fall Christian. I'm not summer. I'm not winter either. I'm not all the way into the winter Christian, but I do tend to find myself asking a lot more questions than to say, well, just let go, let God. And that's okay. Again, how much are we engaging others, though? How much are we putting our faith before us? How much are we asking those questions of one another? I do want to offer as well some things that Beck presents us, because he gives us some ideas and some questions that might be helpful for us, not just individually, but more specifically as the church, right? Because as a church, we need to be asking ourselves, how do we engage others? How do we invite others into this idea of what it means to be a summer or winter Christian? One of the things Beck points us towards is this idea of how many questions we might answer or might ask ourselves. And he puts it this way. He says, why does God allow suffering? And if the answer is given because of free will and that's it, then you might be more of a one question type of person, that we're willing to accept that answer and move on. Again, that's fine. However, if you're more of a two question kind of person, you're likely to follow up the first question with, well, why did God create us with free will if he knew this would be the result? And then, as you would imagine, that question leads to a third question and a fourth question and a fifth. So we're more multiple question kind of people. But the idea there is that wherever we find ourselves, the church has to be faithful and allow both sides to exist. We have to allow those winter Christians an opportunity to ask their questions faithfully. Well, at the same time, we can't say to the summer Christians, if you're not asking these questions of your faith, then your faith isn't mature in some ways. Rob Bell, in his book, Velvet Elvis, offers us this, quote, "We sponsored a doubt night at our church a while back. People were encouraged to write down whatever questions or doubts they had about God and Jesus and the Bible and faith and church. We had to get a larger box to hold all of these scraps of paper. I have page after page of questions on my desk. Heaven and hell and suicide and the devil and God and love and rape, and some very personal, some angry, some desperate, some very deep and philosophical. Most of my responses were about how we allow others to carry our burdens and how our real needs in life are not for more information, but for loving community with other people on the journey." I love that end of that Rob Bell quote, right? That he's pointing us towards the idea that when we face these real difficult challenges in life, it isn't a need for more information that we're after. It's ultimately a need for more community, for a loving community, for high communion, as Beck would say. The need that we have to be engaged with one another, with Scripture, with prayer, with study, with fasting, with the spiritual disciplines, with all these other things, all these things that connect us to God. That's the things that we need. We need to surround ourselves with those in those moments. And so again, as we ask this question of, well, what does a word of hope sound like? What does the word of hope from a prophet sound like? I think it's as basic at its core. A word of hope from the prophet points us towards community. It points us towards being with one another. I know it seems kind of strange, especially right now, to think, well, how do we get hope when we're all socially distancing? But as we mentioned on Easter Sunday, there are so many ways, whether it be physical or not, that we can quarantine ourselves, that we can lock the doors of our own hearts, that we can socially distance ourselves, that we don't have to just experience what we're doing right now. That anytime we experience grief or tragedy in this life, when life throws us a curveball and we move from orientation to disorientation, when we get thrown off our axis, our natural desire is to shut down, to be in grief, to distance ourselves from other people. But the answer in all of this, the word of hope we find in all of this, is when we gather in community, when we seek those places out where we can faithfully find those. And so as we've been asking in this study from the beginning, what does God have to say to us? What might be a word that God has to say to us during this time we find ourselves living in? We began with the Psalms, and so I think it's appropriate to circle back and go all the way back to the Psalms. And again, back to Walter Brueggemann, who has this quote for us that comes from his book on the message of the Psalms. He says, quote, "It is a curious fact that the church has, by and large, continued to sing songs of orientation in a world increasingly experienced as disoriented. It is my judgment that this action of the church is less an evangelical defiance guided by faith and much more a frightened, numb denial and deception that does not want to acknowledge or experience the disorientation of life. The reason for such relentless affirmation of orientation seems to me not from faith, but from the wishful optimism of our culture. Such a denial and cover-up, which I take it to be, is an odd inclination for passionate Bible users, given the larger number of psalms that are songs of lament, protest, and complaint about an incoherence that is experienced in the world. I believe that serious religious use of lament psalms has been minimal because we have believed that faith does not mean to acknowledge and embrace negativity. We have thought that acknowledgement of negativity was somehow an act of unfaithful, as though the very speech about it concealed too much about God's loss of control. The point to be urged here is this: the use of these psalms of darkness may be judged by the world to be acts of unfaith and failure, but for the trusting community, their use is an act of bold faith. Again, I think Brueggemann and Beck here work together. Right, Brueggemann points us to this idea that the world has said you need to be summer Christians, that to offer up anything that's a song of darkness, of grief, of despair, of lament, any of these things, that's baby faith. You're not a real Christian. You haven't grown. You haven't matured in a lot of ways. You need to become more like a summer Christian. And it's not that we all have to become winter Christians. Again, it's not that all we should be doing is reading Psalms of lament and grief. But there has to be a balance. As a way to speak to what Brueggemann has for us, I want to share with you Psalm 116. Psalm 116 actually appears in our lectionary. It's not this Sunday, but the following Sunday. It's the lectionary psalter for the day. But if you go and you look at it, the verses that it has for us, it's omitted a chunk in the middle. And so it reads like this. Let me pull it up for us. I love the Lord because he hears my requests for mercy. I'll call out to him as long as I live because he listens closely to me. Death's ropes bound me, the distress of the grave found me. I came face to face with trouble and grief, so I called the Lord's name. Lord, please save me. What can I give back to the Lord for all the good things he has done for me? I'll lift up the cup of salvation. I'll call on the Lord's name. I'll keep the promises I made to the Lord in the presence of all God's people. The death of the Lord's faithful is a costly loss in his eyes. Oh yes, Lord, I am definitely your servant. I am your servant and your son of your female servant. You freed me from my chains. So I'll offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving to you, and I'll call on the Lord's name. I'll keep the promises I made to the Lord in the presence of all God's people, in the courtyards of the Lord's house, which is in the center of Jerusalem. Praise the Lord. If I were to read Psalm 116 in 2 weeks, if we were to show up in the lectionary, if we were to preach from it, again, we would cut these verses out. Which begs the question, what would we lose? What would be lost in all of this? Well, let's read them. Verse 5. The Lord is merciful and righteous. Our God is compassionate. The Lord protects simple folk. He saves me whenever I am brought down. I tell myself, you can be at peace again, because the Lord has been good to you. You, God, have delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, and my foot from stumbling. So I'll walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I've remained faithful even when I said, I am suffering so badly. Even when I said out of fear, everyone is a liar. This is so crucial to Psalm 116. And again, imagine if we wouldn't have it, if we wouldn't read it and celebrate it and to allow others to experience what the psalmist has to say here. For the psalmist is being honest. The psalmist is expressing something deep within inside of themselves at these moments. Verse 7, I tell myself, I can be at peace again. Right? You can almost hear the psalmist trying to reassure themselves, trying to say, I know I've been hurt, but I'm going to try and live in such a way. I'm going to try and move from disorientation to reorientation. I'm going to try and live in such a way where I can have hope and be at peace again. Verse 10 and 11, I remained faithful even when I said I'm suffering badly or even when I called everyone a liar. Remember that moment when I was at my deepest, darkest place and I hated everyone? I told everyone they were liars. I said no one was my friend. I called them all two-faced and I rejected everyone. And even in that moment when I was fearful, I was still faithful to you, God. Right? That psalm, that part of this psalm would have been lost. We would have just stuck with the, giving things over to God and saying, I'm your servant and I'll keep the promises and all these things and singing God's praises. Again, going back to this Brueggemann quote, the last part I think is so crucial. The point to be urged here is this. The use of these psalms of darkness, or even more so, the parts of darkness that are cut out from a lot of the psalms that we read on Sunday morning, may be judged by the world to be acts of unfaithful and failure, but for the trusting community, their use is an act of bold faith. For the trusting community. Why did he say this? Why did he say for the trusting community? Why didn't he just say for any community? Because I think for the trusting community, the community has to trust that this might not be for me. that I might not find myself in this particular moment when this particular psalm is being read at a place where I think, yep, remember that time where I'm trying to find peace again, or remember that time where I called everyone a liar. I'm not there right now. In fact, I'm more like Psalm 149. Remember that great doxology we read a couple of weeks ago? That's just praise God, praise Him with trumpets, praise Him as a liar, praise Him all over the place, just praise, 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 praise God. It's this great doxology. That's the psalm I want to read, right? I'm more in the summer Christian spot in my life right now, if you will. But if the church just says that's all we're going to do, we're just going to read Psalm 149 and those like it, and anytime we get to a place where it presents darkness or it presents something that is uneasy, we're going to cut that out. We're going to remove it. Then it doesn't allow for those winter Christians to be among us. It doesn't allow for those that have questions. And when we do that, we're missing something. But again, when we allow that to happen, when we allow to say, we're going to sing a word of hope, and we're also going to sing a word of lament, we're going to be able to do both in the same community, then the community is a trusting community. Then the community is able to say, look, I'm not where you are, but you have a place here with me. Because ultimately where we're here for is for God. Ultimately what we're trying to do is to grow closer to God, to sing our praises to God, to offer our words of thanksgiving to God, whatever they may be, even if they're thanksgivings in the form of lament, even if they're ways in which we stay in communion with one another through grief. That's okay. Because ultimately, what happens when we get to this place of hope that the prophet is trying to lead us towards is that we can all find ourselves there if we trust one another to move in that direction. Again, look at some of the prophets we've been reading. Jeremiah, he's had some harsh words for the Israelites, but eventually Jeremiah gets to a place where he's expressing a new covenantal community that's living together. Isaiah, the one we've been reading, he gets to a place that towards the end of Isaiah where he speaks of this city of peace, this city of shalom that the Israelites might inhabit. Ezekiel, which we really haven't delved into a lot because Ezekiel has a lot of explicit language around violence and sexual imagery, and so we haven't really tapped into that one at all. But the end of Ezekiel points us towards the temple being cleansed and filled with the presence of God. But all of this happens in community with the prophet able to express in poetic function these words of grief, these deep laments and sorrows, by not allowing people to stay in denial, but allowing the prophet to express grief allows us to move towards hope. By being able to do that, by being able to offer an opportunity for others to come along in this journey, hope is offered. Hope is offered in whatever form somebody needs to find it in. Again, let's return to where we started this evening with the Shawshank Redemption. The very last scene that we have, the very last words spoken in this movie are from Red. You recall Red's the one that said, hope is a dangerous thing. And Andy said, no, hope is a good thing. They can't take your hope away in Red. No, hope is a dangerous thing. After Andy escapes from prison and then Red goes to see him, spoiler alert if you haven't seen the movie, but not really, more shame on you if you haven't seen one of the greatest movies ever made. I'm not sorry for spoiling this. Red is going to see Andy, but he's not sure if he can get there, right? To get there, he has to break parole and several other things have to happen. But these are the final words of the movie, the final words that Red has to offer us. Let's take a listen here.
I hope I can make it across the border. I hope to see my friend and shake his hand. I hope the Pacific is as blue as it has been in my dreams. I hope.
It's a powerful end to that movie. You know, as we watch the character of Red develop over time, there's another scene we didn't watch where Red and Andy have this exchange where Andy's talking about hope and he's talking about going to live on the beach one day and how wonderful it's going to be. And Red allows himself to smile just for a moment, but then doesn't think it's real, authentic, or a good thing to do. And so he says that you got to stop thinking this. Now, the reality is the beach is all the way down there and you're all the way stuck in here and there's nothing you can do about it. That's just how it is. Stop thinking this. Don't have that hope. That hope will kill you. And as they wrestle back and forth with this, I think this also points us to the answer to the question we've been wrestling with tonight, right? What is that faithful word of hope? How do the prophets bring us that word of hope? What do we need to hear in that word of hope? I think, again, it depends on who we are. It depends on where we find ourselves. What is a word of hope for us? And only we know. Only we know if we're dealing with reality or if we're dealing with denial. Only we know if we're dealing with grief or if we're dealing with despair. Only we know if that word of hope is a true word that we can latch on to, or if it's shallow words that mean nothing to us. I think one of the encouraging things we have, though, is this idea that we're not alone. Again, as Beck points us towards, what we really need more than anything is high communion. We need to be engaged with one another. We need to be engaged with God. We need to be engaged with our biblical text. In fact, to close this evening, I want to skip ahead to the New Testament, to the book of Hebrews, in fact, and read a little bit from chapter 11 and chapter 12. We don't know who wrote Hebrews, but it's a magnificent letter that's just deep in its theology. And in chapter 11 and chapter 12, the author unpacks this idea of faith and hope and what that means, but they do so by looking at those that have gone before us. And again, I would offer, as Beck suggests, that we have to up our communion, if you will, up those that were around, those ways in which we engage others. This is another way that we can do that. Just because we're socially distanced right now and we can't gather together in a Sunday school classroom or something like that, doesn't mean that we don't have those around us who speak to us, who offer us their own lives as a testimony and a witness that we can learn from, that we can be encouraged by. And so Hebrews 11 begins this way. It says, "Faith is the reality of what we hope for, the proof of what we don't see. The elders in the past were approved because they showed faith. By faith, we understand that the universe has been created by a word from God, so that the visible came into existence from the invisible." And then he goes on to describe all of these things that have been done by those that have come before us, all of these acts of faithfulness, these examples, dating all the way back to Abel, to Noah, to Abraham, all those that have come before us and what their faith has been. And then in the middle of telling this, he comes to this verse 13, which I want to read for us. "All these people died in faith without receiving the promises. But they saw the promises from a distance and welcomed them. They confessed that they were strangers and immigrants on earth. People who say this kind of thing make it clear that they are looking for a homeland, that they have been thinking about the country that they had left and they would have the opportunity to return to. But at this point in time, they are longing for a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God isn't ashamed to be called their God. He has prepared a city for them." Again, right in the middle of this, and he goes on to talk about Moses and other Israelite heroes in the faith, but right in the middle of this, he talks about those with hope, those that look towards God, people who have died in the faith. They've done so without receiving some of these promises that have been promised to them. Right? You think of Moses, who died looking at the promised land but not being allowed to enter into it. King David, who died with the idea of the temple and God's presence dwelling in the temple but not being allowed to create it. And on the story goes. This hope that the people have who lived in faith that said, you know what, this might actually not even be accomplished in my lifetime. But I have an ultimate hope. I have an ultimate faith that God's love and endurance will out, that it will move us beyond anything that this world might have to offer us. Which then brings us to chapter 12. Very familiar passage for us, but I think we might hear it a little bit differently this evening. chapter 12 begins this way. I'll read from the NRSV. Therefore, since everything we've read in chapter 11, therefore this great cloud of witnesses that we have, therefore, since we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings to us so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith, who for the sake of the joy that was set before him endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Brothers and sisters, tonight, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, those that are joining us this evening in Bible study through YouTube, those that we're surrounded by traditionally on a Sunday morning, those that we come into encounter with in Bible study and Sunday school, those that we meet at the ball fields who allow us to question and probe our faith deeper and deeper, those that are in the stories of the Old and New Testament, those apostles and disciples who have come before us, those that have been faithful to God, that have shared their stories with us as a testimony to the one true living God. Those that have gone before us in the faith, those family members, those Sunday school teachers, those children's directors, youth directors, those that have passed on from this life to the next life, those that have gone before us, whoever they might be, we are surrounded by such a great community. We have voice that gives us words of hope and assurance and endurance for this time. So let us run that race. Let us turn to the Psalms and read not the redacted versions, but all of the Psalms, every single verse that speaks to us the reality of the lives we live, that celebrates the highs and grieves the lows, that gives us words for all that we might experience. Therefore, since we're surrounded by all of these things, let us faithfully run the race that is set before us, and do so with hope, because we look to Jesus, our pioneer and perfecter in the faith, the one that has gone before us, the one that gives us ultimate hope that nothing in this life, not even death, can detract us or can separate us from God. That we have hope. We will always, always, always be in the presence of Christ and in God, that there's nothing we can experience, no part of this world we can travel that God has not already been before us, and that God won't meet us there. We have hope in that. And that, friends, that kind of hope, that hope will be a word to us that can overcome any lament, any grief, any sorrow we might experience. It can be just the right thing we need in those moments, whether we be a summer or a winter Christian. It can be a word we need to hear at the right time and the right moment. We need to hear it from all of these around us. So go forth from here this evening, seeking to find the ways in which you're living in community. Those that are living with us today, whether it be through Zoom calls or Facebook or what have you, whether it be through gathering for the church, but also seeking to live in the community of faith that we have in the Bible, reading those stories of old and new, of those that have gone before us in the faith. For they will encourage us, and they will give us words when we need them the most, and they will bring about a hope and a peace that only God can offer. Go in peace this night. Amen.